My sister locked me in my room while my blood sugar crashed to 30, and my dad was downstairs believing her lie that I was trying to ruin the dinner party. The key turned in the lock from the outside, and I heard Olivia Bennett's heels clicking down the hallway while my hands shook so badly I could barely hold my phone. My blood sugar monitor showed 52 and dropping fast. That terrifying freefall meant I had maybe 18 minutes before I would lose consciousness completely. I was reaching for my emergency glucose tablets when I heard her walk upstairs. The bottle slipped from my trembling fingers and scattered across the carpet somewhere in the darkness. And then I heard her voice, sweet and apologetic, telling my father downstairs that I was having one of my teenage mood swings and needed time alone to calm down before his business partners arrived for dinner. She told him I had been rude about her cooking and dismissive of the evening's importance, that I had locked myself in my room on purpose to sabotage the dinner party she had spent weeks planning. My father's response was muffled through the floor, but I could tell he believed her. He always did. And in that moment, I understood with crystal clear horror that she had just sentenced me to die alone in my bedroom while they entertained clients downstairs. The glucose tablets were somewhere in the darkness. My backup insulin was in the kitchen refrigerator, and my phone screen was shaking so violently from my trembling hands that I could barely see the numbers, let alone call for help. I was 17 years old with type 1 diabetes, and my father's girlfriend of 7 months had just locked me in my room to create the perfect setting for her networking dinner. Let me take you back to the beginning. I had been managing my type 1 diabetes for 7 years when Olivia Bennett entered our lives. By then, I was comfortable with my routine, testing blood sugar, calculating carbohydrates, delivering insulin through my pump. It was just part of who I was. My mother died when I was 7. For the next 3 years, it was just my father and me, figuring out life together. My diabetes diagnosis at age 10 turned our world into a delicate balance of numbers and timing, but we handled it. Dad worked long hours as a commercial real estate developer, but he always made time for my endocrinologist appointments and made sure I had everything I needed. When he started dating again after Mom had been gone for 4 years, I tried to be supportive. I wanted him to be happy, even if the thought of someone replacing her made my chest tighten. Olivia Bennett was the 5th woman he dated seriously. Unlike the others who had been polite but clearly nervous about taking on a child with a chronic illness, Olivia seemed almost too perfect. She was 36 to my father's 47, a pharmaceutical sales representative with impeccable style and the kind of confidence that made people listen when she spoke. She had researched type 1 diabetes before meeting me, asked thoughtful questions about my management routine, even recommended a new insulin pump model that her company did not sell but had better features than mine. Dad fell hard and fast, and I tried to be happy for him. Pushing down the small voice that whispered her perfection felt like a performance with an agenda I could not quite see. The first warning sign appeared about 4 months into their relationship. Olivia started commenting on my blood sugar readings. She asked to check my numbers every evening, framing it as caring concern. But her tone turned judgmental whenever my levels were not perfect. She would ask if I had counted my carbohydrates correctly or if I was sneaking foods I should not have. Never mind that type 1 diabetes does not work that way. My doctor said my control was excellent. When I tried to explain that blood sugar fluctuates for dozens of reasons beyond food, Olivia smiled and said she worked in pharmaceuticals and understood medical conditions better than most people. Dad nodded along, clearly impressed by her expertise, and I let it go, even though her understanding was shallow and wrong in critical ways. The second red flag came when she moved in after just 6 months of dating. Suddenly, family dinners had to start at exactly 6:30 regardless of my insulin timing. My diabetic supplies had to be stored in designated spots that matched her aesthetic rather than where they were most accessible to me. She reorganized the kitchen and moved my emergency glucose stash from the counter to a high cabinet because the packaging looked cluttered. When I moved them back, she moved them again. Dad intervened by suggesting I keep supplies in my room if Olivia wanted a clean kitchen. He did not understand that diabetic emergencies do not wait for you to run upstairs. But I complied to keep the peace, setting up a small fridge in my room for insulin and stashing glucose tablets around, knowing that fighting back would create confrontation he could not handle. The third warning sign appeared last month when Olivia started planning tonight's dinner party. It was a high-stakes evening. Dad's most important potential clients, the Maxwells, owned a development company that could land him the biggest contract of his career. Olivia had taken over the entire planning process, hired caterers and event staff, transformed our home into something out of a magazine. She was obsessive about details, snapping at both Dad and me when things were not perfect. Lighting, music, flower placement. When I asked about the menu so I could check carb counts and plan my insulin, she waved me off, said she would handle it, that I should not worry about food and just enjoy the evening. The dismissal made my stomach drop. Managing diabetes means I always need to know what and when I am eating. But she made it seem like I was being difficult by asking. Yesterday, she told me I would be eating dinner in my room tonight instead of joining the party. Said having a teenager around would make the event feel too casual. Dad objected weakly, saying I was family and should be included. But Olivia said this was business, not family time, and my presence would distract from professional networking. She promised to bring me a plate and said I could come down for dessert. I agreed because arguing with Olivia always made Dad anxious and stressed. I had learned that keeping the peace was easier than demanding my needs be met. This afternoon, everything shattered. Olivia was in the kitchen supervising the caterers when I came down around 4 to check my blood sugar and grab a snack before dinner. My continuous glucose monitor had been drifting down all afternoon, hovering in the low 80s. I needed something to bring it up before it dropped into dangerous territory. I had just grabbed a juice box from the fridge when Olivia appeared beside me, her face twisted with fury. She snatched the juice box from my hand and told me I was not allowed to eat or drink anything before the dinner party. The caterers needed the kitchen cleared, and she did not want me interfering with their work. I tried to explain that my blood sugar was dropping and I needed the juice now, not later. She cut me off, called me overdramatic, accused me of trying to sabotage her evening by creating medical crises that demanded attention. Said I was jealous that Dad had found someone new and was manipulating situations with my diabetes. The accusations were so shocking, so disconnected from reality, that I stood frozen as she threw the juice box in the trash and ordered me to go to my room and stay there until she came to get me for dinner. When I protested, she leaned in close and whispered that if I caused any problems tonight, if I made a scene or tried to divert Dad's attention from his clients, she would make sure he knew how manipulative I had been about my medical condition. She reminded me that Dad's business was struggling, that this deal could save our family's finances, that my selfishness had the potential to destroy everything he had worked so hard for. I went upstairs, shaking with rage and fear. My blood sugar was at 70 and falling. I texted Dad that I needed help, but his phone was on silent for the dinner preparations. I checked my supplies. My backup emergency glucose was in the kitchen, where Olivia had just banned me. My insulin pump showed plenty in the reservoir, but I would need to change it tomorrow. The logical thing would have been to go downstairs and get juice while Olivia was distracted. But her threats and my father's dependence on tonight's success had paralyzed me. Instead, I tried to manage with the glucose tablets I had in my room. I took 4 and waited to see if my levels would stabilize. For 30 minutes, I watched my CGM. It hovered in the mid-70s before starting to drop again. At 60, I knew I needed more glucose. I grabbed the bottle to take more tablets. That is when I heard Olivia coming up the stairs. I went to the door to beg her to bring juice, convinced that surely she would not let me go into diabetic shock. But as I opened the door, she was already there, hand raised to knock. Her face was cold and determined. She pushed me back into the room and told me I needed to stay put until the clients left because she could not trust me not to ruin her evening. She noticed my glucose tablet bottle and kicked it away when it fell. Then she walked out and locked the door from the outside with the old-fashioned key we had never used. The antique mechanism Dad thought was charming when we bought the house. Now I was on my hands and knees, groping across the carpet for scattered glucose tablets, my vision starting to blur around the edges. My CGM was screaming alarms. 45 and dropping fast. A rapid descent that would leave me unconscious within minutes. I found 3 tablets and shoved them in my mouth desperately. The chalky taste that used to feel comforting now felt like a reminder of how inadequate they were for this crisis. When I finally managed to unlock my phone, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely hold it. My fingers would not cooperate with the touchscreen to dial 911. I tried calling Dad. Straight to voicemail. His phone was still on silent for the dinner party. I tried texting my best friend Sophia, but the message came out as gibberish. Autocorrect could not make sense of my failing motor control. Below me, I could hear the dinner party beginning. People greeting each other with professional warmth. Olivia's laugh, bright and charming, as she welcomed the Maxwells to our home. The sounds felt surreal compared to my reality. A normal social gathering happening while I lay dying of hypoglycemia 20 feet above them. I thought about screaming for help, but Olivia had turned up classical piano music downstairs that would drown out any sounds from upstairs. She had planned this meticulously, ensuring that even if I tried to attract attention, the dinner party would continue uninterrupted. I made it to my bed before my legs gave out completely, falling onto the mattress as my blood sugar continued to plummet. At 37, I knew I was in serious danger. That was the level where seizures and unconsciousness happen, where permanent brain damage becomes a real possibility. My thoughts were getting scattered and slow. Severe hypoglycemia causes cognitive impairment, making problem-solving increasingly difficult. I tried the door again, crawling because standing was no longer possible. I tugged on the handle with weak hands. The lock held firm. Olivia must have taken the key because I could not see it through the old-fashioned keyhole. My window was on the second floor, overlooking the backyard, too high to jump safely and facing away from the street where someone might see me. I thought about smashing the window and yelling. But the dinner party was in the formal dining room on the opposite side of the house. The caterers were in the kitchen. The music would swallow any sounds. Besides, breaking a window during Dad's most important business dinner would tank the deal he desperately needed. It would prove Olivia's claim that I was trying to sabotage the evening. The thought caught me between survival instinct and the psychological manipulation she had spent months perfecting. For a moment, I actually wondered if dying quietly was better than ruining her perfect night. My phone buzzed with a text from Sophia asking if I wanted to video chat. I tried to respond, but my fingers had stopped working. The CGM read 34. Critically low. I could feel consciousness slipping away in waves. I thought about my mother. How she never would have let this happen. How she would have put my health before any business dinner or social obligation. I thought about Dad downstairs, completely unaware that his daughter was dying 20 feet above him because he had trusted his girlfriend over his own instincts. For a brief moment, the anger that surged through me cleared my head enough to try one more time to call 911. My hand was shaking so badly I could not see the screen. But I managed to press the emergency call button before my vision tunneled to a pinpoint and everything went dark. I do not know if the call connected. I do not know if I said anything coherent. I only know that I felt myself slipping into darkness while dinner party conversation and laughter filtered through my bedroom floor. I woke to voices fighting nearby and bright lights piercing my closed eyelids. Someone was saying my name, asking me to open my eyes. When I cracked them open, I saw a paramedic's face hovering above me. She was young, maybe late 20s, with kind eyes and hair pulled back in a bun. She was telling me I was okay, that they had given me glucagon, that my blood sugar was coming back up. My arm stung wherein 4 had been inserted. I could taste the sickly sweet residue of the glucagon injection that had saved my life. The paramedic introduced herself as Emma Lawson from LA County Fire Department and asked if I could tell her what happened. My mouth was dry and my mind was foggy, but I managed to whisper that I had been locked in my room. Emma's expression shifted immediately from professional concern to focused intensity. She asked me to repeat that. Behind her, I could see another paramedic talking to someone in the doorway. Even with my vision still blurry, I recognized my father's silhouette. His posture radiated confusion and fear. Emma leaned in and asked directly, "Who locked me in?" "When?" I told her. "Olivia. About 2 hours ago, just before the dinner party." The other paramedic exchanged a look with Emma, then called for police officers who had apparently arrived with the ambulance. The next 30 minutes were a blur of medical assessments and careful questions. Emma stayed with me while her partner, an older man named Rick Turner who had been a paramedic for 18 years, checked my vitals and tested my blood sugar again. They told me that 911 had received a call from my phone around 7:20. The dispatcher heard labored breathing, then silence. When they could not get a response, they sent emergency crews to my address. The fire department arrived first and found the front door locked with the dinner party still in progress. They pounded until someone answered, then forced their way upstairs when they heard my CGM alarm screaming through my bedroom door. They found the door locked from the outside with the old skeleton key still in the lock. They found me unconscious on the floor with my blood sugar at 30, dangerously low for an extended period. Rick said they had administered glucagon immediately and called for police backup because the locked door situation raised serious concerns about possible neglect or abuse. Now, there were two LAPD officers in my room. Detective Mia Sullivan, who had been on the force for 12 years, and a uniformed officer named Daniel Grant, who was photographing the door, the lock, and the scattered glucose tablets on my carpet. Detective Sullivan crouched beside my bed and asked if I felt well enough to answer questions. When I nodded, she took out a recording device and asked me to walk her through everything that had happened that day from the beginning. I told her everything. My voice grew stronger as my blood sugar stabilized. The words poured out in a flood of anger, fear, and relief. I explained how Olivia had been relocating my glucose supplies, the juice box incident that afternoon, her accusations that I was trying to ruin the dinner party, how she had locked me in just as my blood sugar was crashing. Detective Sullivan listened without interrupting, her expression neutral but her eyes sharp. When I finished, she asked specific follow-up questions about timing, exact words Olivia had used, whether there were witnesses to her threats, any evidence like texts or recordings. I pulled up my text thread with Dad showing my unanswered pleas for help. I showed her my CGM app data documenting the blood sugar drop and critical alarms. I mentioned that the caterers might have witnessed the juice box incident that afternoon. Detective Sullivan nodded and said she would be interviewing everyone in the house, that this was now a criminal investigation into child endangerment and possible attempted murder. The phrase attempted murder made my chest constrict. The reality of how close I had come to death became viscerally real. Emma noticed my distress and suggested they let me rest before asking more questions. But I shook my head and said I wanted to finish. I wanted to make sure they understood that Olivia had done this deliberately, that it was not a mistake or misunderstanding. Dad came into the room after Detective Sullivan finished her initial questioning. His face was ashen. His eyes were red like he had been crying. He knelt beside the bed and took my hand, saying he was sorry, that he had no idea what was happening, that Olivia had told him I was fine and just needed space. His voice cracked as he asked why I had not come downstairs if I was having a medical emergency. I had to explain that I had been locked in, that I had tried to call and text, that I had done everything I could to get help. The realization that his girlfriend had deliberately hurt his child while he was 20 feet away entertaining guests seemed to break something inside him. He sobbed against the bed, and I found myself comforting him even though I had nearly died. Emma and Rick exchanged glances but did not interfere, allowing the scene to unfold as they prepared to transport me to the hospital for observation. Detective Sullivan stepped into the hallway to confer with Officer Grant, and I could hear her giving instructions about securing the scene and separating witnesses for questioning. The dinner party had apparently been disrupted when the paramedics forced their way in. The Maxwells and catering staff had been escorted out after everyone gave statements about what they had seen and heard. Olivia was in the hallway being questioned by another officer when they wheeled me out on the stretcher. She still looked perfect, her dinner dress unwrinkled, her makeup flawless. But her face was cold fury barely hidden beneath a mask of concern. She tried to approach me, saying she had been so worried, that she was relieved I was okay. Detective Sullivan physically stepped between us and told her to stay back. Olivia's mask slipped for just a second. Her eyes flashed with something ugly before the concerned girlfriend performance resumed. She turned to my father and explained that she had just been trying to give me space to calm down, that she had no idea my blood sugar was dropping, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. Dad had been following the stretcher, but he stopped, turned to face her, really looked at her. I saw something shift in his expression. He asked her about taking the key when she left my room, about moving my glucose supplies out of the kitchen, about throwing away my juice box when I said I needed it. Olivia's face cycled through several emotions before settling on defensive anger. She said she had been trying to teach me responsibility and independence, that I had been manipulating him with my diabetes for years, that she was helping him set appropriate boundaries. The words hung in the hallway like poison, revealing everything she had been doing for months. And Dad's face shifted from devastation to fury so quickly I barely tracked the transition. He told her to get out of his house, that she had 1 hour to collect her things before he called the police to remove her. The ambulance ride to UCLA Medical Center took 20 minutes. Emma stayed with me in the back, while Dad followed in his car. She kept monitoring my blood sugar and talking to me, making sure I was alert and responsive. She asked about my usual management routine and how long I had been type 1. When I shared my history, she said I had been doing remarkably well given the circumstances. That many kids my age struggled with compliance, but my A1C numbers showed excellent control. The validation felt essential after months of Olivia suggesting I was careless and dramatic about my health. Emma asked carefully about previous incidents where Olivia had interfered with my diabetes management, and I realized there were dozens of small moments I had minimized or explained away. She had insisted I could not test my blood sugar at the dinner table because it was unsanitary, forcing me to go to the bathroom and miss the timing windows I needed for insulin dosing. She had questioned whether I really needed snacks between meals or whether I was just trying to eat junk food. She had even suggested to Dad that I might be faking symptoms to get attention. That teenagers were known for drama, and everyone should probably just ignore my complaints. Each memory looked different now, not as misunderstandings, but as calculated attempts to undermine my health management and my relationship with my father. Emma listened without judgment and said she was documenting everything for the police report, that this pattern would be important evidence. I was admitted to the hospital's pediatric unit for observation. Standard protocol after a severe hypoglycemic episode. My blood sugar had stabilized at 98, solidly normal. But Dr. Charles Morgan, the attending endocrinologist who had been called in, wanted to monitor me overnight to ensure there were no complications. Dr. Morgan was in his 50s with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses. His credentials on the wall showed 26 years practicing pediatric endocrinology. He reviewed my medical history with Dad and me, asking detailed questions about my management routine and what had led to tonight's crisis. When I described Olivia restricting my access to glucose and locking me in my room, his expression went carefully blank. The look doctors get when they hear information that triggers mandatory reporting requirements. He excused himself and returned 10 minutes later with a woman he introduced as Natalie Miller, a social worker with Child Protective Services who specialized in medical neglect cases. Natalie was maybe 40 with warm brown eyes and a no-nonsense manner that immediately made me feel safer. She pulled up a chair next to my bed and said she needed to hear my story, that what happened tonight was serious medical neglect and potentially deliberate endangerment. I told the whole story again, this time with Dad sitting beside me, hearing all the details I had not shared about Olivia's behavior over the past months. I watched his face as I described each incident. Watched him connect dots he had missed while it was happening. Watched him see how methodically she had isolated me and undermined my health management. Natalie took careful notes and asked clarifying questions. Had Olivia ever prevented me from accessing medical treatment or diabetic supplies directly? When I described her moving my emergency glucose to hard-to-reach places and her comments about me exaggerating symptoms, Natalie nodded like she had heard similar patterns before. She explained that caregivers of children with medical conditions have a legal duty to provide access to necessary treatments. Deliberately withholding that access can constitute abuse under California law. She said CPS would open an investigation, that Detective Sullivan was already coordinating with her office, and that they would determine whether Dad's home was safe for me given what had happened. Dad's face went white. He asked if they were going to take me away. Natalie's expression softened. She said that was not the goal. The investigation was about identifying what safeguards needed to be in place. But Olivia could no longer have access to me or be present in any home where I lived. Detective Sullivan returned around 10 that night with updates on the investigation. She had interviewed the catering staff. 2 of them had witnessed the juice box incident, confirming my account that Olivia had physically taken necessary medical supplies from me despite my explanation that I needed them. She had also interviewed the Maxwells, who had an interesting perspective on the dinner party. Apparently, when the paramedics burst in, Olivia had tried to stop them from going upstairs. Claimed I was fine and just being dramatic. One of the paramedics heard my CGM alarm from the second floor and pushed past her anyway. The Maxwells had watched Olivia's facade crack completely. Her concern transformed into rage at having her evening disrupted. Mrs. Maxwell had specifically told Detective Sullivan that Olivia's behavior struck her as inappropriate, that she seemed more concerned about the dinner party than a medical emergency, that she had tried to convince the paramedics to leave without checking on me. The testimony was damning. outside witnesses with no reason to lie describing Olivia's priorities. Detective Sullivan said she had also obtained the 911 recording from my phone call. While mostly incoherent, I had managed to gasp out the words "locked in" and "dying" before losing consciousness, proving I was aware of the deliberate imprisonment. The combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and my statement was sufficient to support criminal charges. The DA's office was reviewing possible charges including child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. Dad stayed with me in the hospital room that night, sitting in the uncomfortable chair beside my bed despite my insistence that he go home and rest. He seemed to have aged years in just a few hours as the reality of what had almost happened hit him in waves. When I woke around midnight, I found him staring at his phone with tears streaming down his face. He had been scrolling through text conversations between him and Olivia from the past 7 months, seeing them differently now, spotting manipulation he had missed in the moment. He showed me some of the messages where she had subtly undermined me, told him I was being difficult about my diabetes management, suggested I was jealous of their relationship and using medical situations to get attention. Dad said he had trusted her because she seemed so knowledgeable and confident. He wanted to believe someone loved him enough to handle the complications of our life. He had ignored his own instincts that something was wrong because he had been lonely, and Olivia had felt like the answer to that loneliness. He apologized again, more specifically this time, acknowledged that he had failed to protect me, that he had chosen his girlfriend's version of events over his daughter's truth, that he had allowed someone dangerous into our home. I told him it was not his fault that Olivia had been manipulative, but he shook his head, said it was his responsibility to pay attention, that he had been so focused on his work and his relationship that he had missed warning signs that should have been obvious. Dr. Morgan discharged me the following afternoon with strict instructions to see my regular endocrinologist and to have unrestricted access to diabetic supplies at all times. He documented the incident thoroughly and said the medical records would be made available to law enforcement and CPS for their investigations. He also gave Dad a list of warning signs for medical neglect and abuse, emphasizing how critical it was to protect chronic illness management and how devastating interference could be. Dad told me on the drive home that Olivia had left the house with 2 suitcases the night before, that he had changed the locks that morning, that he had filed for a restraining order with Detective Sullivan's help. Olivia was prohibited from coming within 500 feet of me or our home, banned from contacting either of us, and would face immediate arrest if she violated those terms. He had also contacted a family law attorney named Rachel Anderson who specialized in custody and protection matters. She advised him to document everything and cooperate fully with CPS to demonstrate he was taking the situation seriously and ensuring my safety. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following week. Rachel predicted Olivia would fight it, claiming everything was a misunderstanding and that I had been having a medical episode she did not understand. When we got home, the house felt different, emptier, but also safer. Olivia's presence had been erased. Dad had removed all her things, including the fancy furniture and the photos she had put up on the walls, leaving spaces that looked bare but felt clean. He had also restored my diabetic supplies to their proper places. Emergency glucose on the kitchen counter and stashed around the house, never more than a few steps away from help if I needed it. He had set up CGM sharing on his phone so he could monitor my blood sugar levels remotely. Olivia had convinced him that was invasive helicopter parenting, but it was actually standard practice for type 1 management. He was overcompensating. I could tell, hovering, asking if I needed anything every few minutes. But I allowed it because we both needed the reassurance that came from attentiveness. Sophia came over that evening with flowers and chocolate-covered pretzels, my favorite comfort food that I could have as long as I bolused properly for the carbs. She had been monitoring my sporadic text updates and gotten worried when I went silent during the hypoglycemic episode. She said she had almost called the police herself, but figured I was just asleep. She felt guilty now for not acting on her instinct. I had to tell her the same thing I had told Dad. Olivia's manipulation was so effective that nobody realized what was happening until it was almost too late. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Within 4 days, Olivia Bennett was charged with child endangerment, false imprisonment, and assault. The assault charge was based on her physically shoving me into my room and forcibly removing medical supplies I needed, both of which constituted harmful contact under California law. Detective Sullivan called to explain that the district attorney took these cases seriously, especially when there was clear evidence and witness testimony. Olivia had been arrested that morning at her temporary residence. Bail was set at $50,000, which her family quickly paid. But the conditions of her release included an enforced restraining order and GPS monitoring to ensure she stayed away from us. Detective Sullivan said the evidence was strong. The 911 audio, witness statements, medical records, and my testimony left little room for Olivia to claim ignorance or accident. The DA was pushing for trial rather than a plea deal, wanting to make an example of someone who deliberately endangered a child with a medical condition. The trial was scheduled for 4 months out, standard timeline for criminal proceedings. Detective Sullivan told me I would have to testify. The thought terrified me, but it also felt necessary, like I needed to stand up in court and publicly declare what Olivia had done. CPS completed their investigation 2 weeks later with a finding of substantiated medical neglect against Olivia, but no findings against Dad. Natalie Miller came to meet with us and explained that the investigation had determined Dad was an unwitting victim of Olivia's manipulation. He had no knowledge of her interference with my diabetes management and had taken immediate corrective action once he understood the situation. She said the home was now considered safe for me, but she recommended family counseling to help us process what had happened and rebuild trust. She also suggested I see a therapist individually to work through the trauma of the incident, especially the terror of being locked in during a medical crisis. Dad agreed to everything. He had already scheduled appointments with Dr. Robert Hayes, a family therapist who specialized in trauma recovery. Dr. Hayes was in his 60s with a calming presence. In our first session, he helped us begin to untangle the guilt, anger, and fear that had become knotted together. He worked with Dad on understanding how he had been deceived and on rebuilding confidence in his parenting instincts. He helped me process the betrayal of someone who should have protected me instead choosing to harm me, and on separating that experience from my ability to trust people in the future. The restraining order hearing came 4 weeks after the incident. It was my first time seeing Olivia since that night. She looked different in court, less polished, more desperate. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, and her makeup could not quite hide the strain. Her attorney argued that the restraining order was excessive, that Olivia had made an error in judgment but meant no harm, that she was willing to apologize and make amends. Rachel Anderson, Dad's lawyer, presented the evidence systematically. Medical records showing how close I had come to death. Witness statements describing Olivia's behavior. The timeline demonstrating her premeditated actions. She played portions of the 911 recording where my garbled voice gasped for help despite being too weak to form complete words. I watched Olivia's face as she listened. There was no remorse, only calculation about how this would affect her case. Judge Catherine O'Connor, who had been on the bench for 15 years, heard everything before issuing her ruling. She found that Olivia posed a genuine threat to my safety, that her actions were deliberate and knowing, that the restraining order would remain in effect for 5 years, with potential extension depending on the outcome of the criminal trial. Judge O'Connor also noted concern about Olivia's apparent lack of remorse in court, said she seemed more focused on minimizing her actions than addressing the harm she had caused. Olivia's face hardened at the ruling. The mask dropped completely. For a moment, I saw the person who had locked me in my room and walked away. The trial began in late October, for months after the incident. It received significant media coverage. Local news had picked up on the story, framing it as a cautionary tale about adults who refused to take children's medical conditions seriously. The courtroom was packed with reporters and advocates for diabetic children's rights. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Jennifer Hayes, who had been trying criminal cases for 19 years, built a methodical case that started with Olivia's relationship with Dad and ended with the night she locked me in my room. Jennifer called witnesses in strategic order. First, the caterers who witnessed the juice box incident. Then the paramedics who found me unconscious. Then Dr. Charles Morgan discussing the medical reality of hypoglycemia. Then Detective Sullivan walking through the evidence and investigation. Each witness added more damaging testimony, building a picture of deliberate harm that could not be explained away as accident or ignorance. When it was my turn to testify, Jennifer guided me through events carefully. She asked precise questions that allowed me to tell the story in my own words while ensuring the legal elements were covered. I described my diabetes management, Olivia's months of interference, the specific threats she made that afternoon, hearing the key turn in the lock while my blood sugar was crashing. I described the terror of being trapped, knowing I was dying but unable to get help, hearing the dinner party continue while I lost consciousness on my bedroom floor. Olivia's defense attorney, Mark Donovan, who specialized in criminal defense, tried to introduce reasonable doubt. He suggested I had accidentally locked myself in, that Olivia was unaware of my condition's severity, that she had been acting on advice from pharmaceutical colleagues who told her teenagers commonly exaggerated symptoms. His cross-examination was aggressive. He implied I was a difficult teenager who resented Olivia's presence and had staged situations to turn Dad against her. He asked if I had ever lied about blood sugar readings, skipped insulin doses deliberately, or manipulated my diabetes to get attention or avoid responsibilities. Rachel had prepared me for this approach, told me defense counsel would try to undermine my credibility. I answered each question calmly and honestly, acknowledging that I had made management mistakes like any teenager, but emphasizing that none of that justified being locked in a room during a medical emergency. The jury was paying close attention during these exchanges. I could see several of them looking at Olivia with disgust, especially when Mark Donovan suggested I had orchestrated the entire incident to frame an innocent woman. The suggestion was so absurd and cruel that even Mark seemed to recognize he had lost the jury with that approach. The prosecution's closing argument was devastating. Jennifer Hayes walked the jury through every piece of evidence, every witness statement, every documented instance of Olivia's deliberate interference with my medical care. She pointed out that Olivia worked in pharmaceuticals, that she knew about hypoglycemia and its dangers, that her claims of ignorance were directly contradicted by her professional background. She played the 911 recording again, my voice barely audible, gasping for help while locked in my own room. She asked the jurors to imagine their own child trapped and dying while an adult who could help walked away. She reminded them I was 17 years old with a manageable medical condition who should have been safe in my own home. Instead, I had nearly died because someone decided a business dinner was more important than a child's life. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: child endangerment, false imprisonment, assault. Olivia's face was expressionless as the verdicts were read, but her hands gripped the defense table so hard her knuckles went white. Judge O'Connor scheduled sentencing for 4 weeks out. Olivia was remanded to custody pending that hearing. The judge noted her lack of remorse and flight risk given the likely prison sentence she faced. Sentencing day was cold and rainy, fitting weather for the occasion. The courtroom was packed again, this time with victim advocates and medical professionals who had submitted impact statements emphasizing the importance of taking children's medical needs seriously. During the sentencing phase, Judge O'Connor heard testimony from multiple witnesses. Dr. Harris, my regular endocrinologist, testified that my diabetes control had been excellent before Olivia's interference and that her actions had put me at risk of permanent consequences. Dr. Morgan gave expert testimony that my blood sugar level of 30 represented an immediately life-threatening emergency, that another 10 minutes without intervention could have resulted in severe brain damage or death. Natalie Miller from CPS stated that medical neglect cases were particularly dangerous because vulnerable children depended on adults for survival. And I read a victim impact statement I had written and rewritten dozens of times, trying to capture the lasting effects of being harmed by someone who was supposed to care for me. I talked about still having nightmares about being locked in that room, about fearing blood sugar drops because I had associated hypoglycemia with being trapped and helpless, about how Olivia had stolen something I could never get back, the assumption that adults in my life would prioritize my safety over their own convenience. Judge O'Connor sentenced Olivia to 9 years in state prison, the maximum allowed under California sentencing guidelines for the combined offenses. She noted that the sentence reflected Olivia's premeditated actions, her abuse of a position of trust, her lack of remorse, and the severe harm she had caused. She stated that Olivia had prioritized social image over a child's life, that she had systematically undermined medical care for months, that her actions on the night of the dinner party were calculated and intentional. She said that caregivers have a fundamental duty to protect children, that violating that duty in such an egregious manner warranted serious consequences. Olivia would be eligible for parole after serving 85% of her sentence, approximately 7.5 years. But Judge O'Connor advised the parole board to consider her complete lack of remorse when evaluating her for release. As Olivia was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she looked directly at me with undisguised venom. No pretense remaining. She had lost everything. Her freedom, her reputation, her future. And she blamed me for it rather than taking responsibility for her own actions. I held her gaze and felt nothing. No fear. No anger. Just the cold certainty that justice had been served and she would never be able to touch me again. Dad and I walked out of the courthouse together. A crowd of media waited outside for comments, but Rachel handled them while we slipped out a side entrance. The case had become a focal point for discussions about medical neglect and the particular vulnerability of children with chronic illnesses. Diabetes advocacy organizations used the trial to push for better education about type 1 diabetes and stronger protections for children requiring medical care. I received hundreds of messages from other type 1 diabetics who had experienced similar dismissals of their symptoms or interference with their management. People who said that seeing someone held accountable gave them hope that their own experiences might be taken seriously. The attention was exhausting, but it was also validation that what happened to me mattered beyond my own experience. In the weeks following sentencing, several medical organizations updated their guidelines on recognizing and reporting medical neglect, specifically including examples like adults withholding access to glucose or insulin. Schools revised their diabetes management policies to ensure students had unrestricted access to supplies and could not be denied treatment for hypoglycemia. The changes felt like something good emerging from pain. Like Olivia's cruelty had inadvertently raised awareness that might help other children. 7 months after the trial, Dad and I had found a new normal. We had been through intensive family therapy with Dr. Hayes, working through the guilt, broken trust, and fear that had nearly destroyed our relationship. Dad had learned to be more vigilant about my medical care without being overbearing. I had learned to voice my needs more clearly instead of staying quiet to avoid causing problems. We had established new routines and boundaries. Dad checking in on my blood sugar without judgment. Me being honest about when I was struggling instead of trying to hide it to avoid being difficult. The house had been redecorated. Olivia's spaces all filled with furniture and photos that reflected our real life together rather than some polished performance. Dad had stepped back from his aggressive business development, recognizing that being present for me mattered more than landing bigger deals. Ironically, the Maxwells had reached out to Dad after the trial to express their support. They ended up offering him an even bigger contract than the original dinner party had hoped to secure. Mrs. Maxwell said they valued integrity over social performance. That Dad's immediate protective response once he understood the situation impressed them more than any carefully curated dinner party ever could have. I had started a blog about diabetes management from a teenager's perspective, sharing practical advice alongside stories about navigating chronic illness while growing up. The blog had gained an unexpected following, connecting me with other young people dealing with medical conditions and providing a community of support I had not realized I needed. Writing about my experience was therapeutic, transforming pain into advocacy. The response from readers showed that sharing truth about difficult experiences could help others feel less alone. Sophia had become even more involved in my diabetes management. She learned about hypoglycemia symptoms and how to administer glucagon. She had become the kind of emergency backup I needed when Dad was not around. She had also been my strongest supporter throughout the trial and recovery, offering distraction and normalcy when everything felt overwhelming. Our friendship had deepened through the crisis. I had learned that real support meant people who believed you and acted on that belief rather than people who expressed concern while prioritizing other things. A year after the incident, I testified before the California State Legislature about medical neglect and the need for stronger protections for children with chronic illnesses. The testimony was part of a larger effort to pass legislation that would specifically criminalize interference with a child's medical care, closing loopholes that had previously allowed adults to claim ignorance or accident. I described my experience in clinical detail, how systematic interference had nearly killed me. I asked lawmakers to treat these cases as seriously as they would physical abuse. The committee chair thanked me for speaking out, Several legislators specifically cited my case when they introduced the Medical Care Protection Act, which would strengthen reporting requirements and increase penalties for adults who deliberately prevent children from accessing critical medical treatment. The bill passed both houses and was signed into law 7 months later. Knowing that my trauma had contributed to systemic change helped me find meaning in what happened. Olivia had tried to silence me, to make my needs invisible, but her cruelty had amplified my voice in ways she never anticipated. I am 19 now. I manage my type 1 diabetes confidently and well. I am attending UCLA, studying public health with a focus on chronic illness management in vulnerable populations. My A1C is consistently in the excellent range. Proof that I have maintained the control I always had despite Olivia's attempts to undermine it. Dad and I have rebuilt our relationship. Not the same as before, but something deeper, built on tested trust and demonstrated commitment. He has not dated seriously since Olivia. He focused on rebuilding our family and supporting my goals. We still talk about that night sometimes, working through layers of trauma and manipulation that continue to surface years later. The physical scars are minimal. Some minor cognitive effects from the prolonged severe hypoglycemia occasionally interfere with my memory, but the emotional wounds have required ongoing care to heal. Therapy continues, probably will for a long time, helping me separate what happened from who I am, ensuring that Olivia's actions do not define my relationship with trust or vulnerability. The locked door still appears in dreams sometimes, but less frequently now, and when it does, I wake up knowing I am safe, that the door is open, that supplies are close, that people who love me are listening for me. Olivia is still in prison. She will be eligible for parole next year. I have already written a statement for the parole board explaining why I believe she remains a threat, documenting her complete lack of remorse and the deliberate nature of her actions. Detective Sullivan told me that prison records show she has never accepted responsibility, never acknowledged guilt. She still claims she was the victim of a teenage scheme. That ongoing denial strengthens the case for denying parole, shows that she has not rehabilitated or learned from her actions. I am prepared to testify at her parole hearing if necessary, to stand up one more time and say that locking a diabetic child in a room while she died deserved every day of that 9-year sentence. The state agrees with me. That agrees with me. Most importantly, I agree with myself. She nearly killed me for a dinner party, for her image, for her need to control. Some actions deserve consequences rather than forgiveness. I have made peace with being the one who ensures she faces the full weight of hers. Sophia sometimes asks if I am angry, if I resent having those months stolen from me. Fear, manipulation, and a near-death experience altering the trajectory of my life. The answer is complicated. I am angry about what happened. The betrayal, the cruelty, the system that almost allowed someone to kill me in my own home. But I am also grateful in unexpected ways. Grateful that I survived, that my voice mattered, that the experience taught me about strength I did not know I possessed. I learned I could face someone in court and speak the truth, that I could turn trauma into advocacy, that surviving a crisis sometimes meant helping others survive theirs. Would I choose to go through it again? Never. But having gone through it, I am choosing to make it mean something more than just survival. The night Olivia locked that door and walked away, she thought she was silencing a problem. Instead, she created a voice that would be heard. And in the end, that voice locked her away instead.